So as promised, this video is about the Central Processing Unit, CPU. Okay, so the CPU, the Central Processor Unit, is the heart of your simulator. As I said, the thing that makes all of the calculations, the processes, it can be one of the fundamental elements that you can upgrade to make the computer faster, but you just need to be aware that not every CPU will fit on or in every motherboard. So the first thing to say is that there are a number of different types of CPU, and the main one is the make. So the biggest difference between them is there's an Intel processor, which you'll need for an Intel motherboard, and an AMD processor, which will fit in an AMD motherboard. They're quite fundamental. You can't really swap the two, and you can Google them and you can do quite a lot to look at the comparative benefits of those two processors. I personally prefer Intel motherboards and Intel processors. I just think they are, for me, a little bit easier to configure, and but again, that's a question of personal choice. So the easiest thing would be an upgrade of a processor that simply fits in your motherboard. So if you look at the CPU's Z tab, as I said, look at the socket type, the socket number. So this is an Intel motherboard, and the socket number will tell you what processor socket you've got in there. You can look online, and if you've got later processors that fit in that socket, then you can simply swap out the processor, and I'll talk a bit later about what's involved in swapping out the processor. So it becomes a little bit more complicated if you want to go up a generation or two in the processors, and as I said in the earlier video, I think there's a bit of cynicism. It is about the chipset, the way that the motherboard talks to the processor. So there is, I think, an inherent need in some cases to upgrade the motherboard. But I think manufacturers sometimes just change the socket, so you have to get a new motherboard when they bring out a new processor, in my opinion. So you look at the chipset. If your new processor that you've researched and the series of the processor that you want has a different socket number, a different series or set out of pins, then you're going to have to upgrade the motherboard as well, and I'll talk about that in the next video. I did wonder which order to do this in. It's a bit of a chicken and egg, but they decided to start with the CPU because you can swap out the CPU in an existing motherboard. So, and also in line with the tabs on CPU Z, I thought it would make more sense. So if you're going to buy a new CPU, Central Processor Unit, then again, you need to look at in my view, the highest model that you can afford. As I say, there are AMD and Intel processors, but you'll also find that there are models that have they're able to process more instructions simultaneously. So in the Intel series, there's an i5, an i7, an i9. Each of them are generations of processor, but within each generation, and you can look at comparison charts, you'll see that they have different capabilities, and those capabilities are useful for different things that you want the computer to do. So In my opinion, the speed of the processor for the purpose of Flight Simulator is more important than any parallel calculations and multiple calculations that it can do. So if you find a processor that's got multiple cores, some of them 4 cores, or you have and it's able to do threading or hyper-threading, which just means do more than one calculation at the same time. That's quite useful for things like videos and creating graphics on video programs, video editing. But for the purpose of the simulator, in my opinion, the main thing that you are looking for is the speed. It's usually described in gigahertz, the speed of the processor. So I would say go for the fastest processor. In my opinion, single core is fine. Multiple core is more expensive, gives you more flexibility if you want to use different programs, but that's just a question of, again, of personal choice. The main thing to watch out for, particularly with the Intel processors, is, as I said in the earlier video, the K at the end of the number, which means that it's more flexible in terms of overclocking. You can actually, that's more advanced. We get past the upgrade first, but it will give you more flexibility in the future if the processor has a K on the end. Okay, so you've chosen your processor. If it's the same socket, you can simply swap out the processor from and in your existing motherboard. If it's a different socket, you'll need to swap out the whole of the motherboard. And if you're buying a motherboard, then often you can buy them in a motherboard bundle, which will come with the processor that fits, and also possibly with some memory. Sometimes that's a bit cheaper, not a lot cheaper, but it's worth considering if you need to go to a later version of a new socket. So I'm going to pause there. I hope that makes sense, and just recap really. So the CPU, central processor unit, can be upgraded. It needs to be upgraded in the same socket, the same series of pins as in your existing motherboard. If the generation of processors you want to put in is further and more advanced, then you need to look at the socket set, the socket that it will drop into, and it is quite likely you'll need to upgrade the motherboard as well. And if you're upgrading the motherboard, you need to remember it might have a different type of memory module, so you'll need to look at, in that case, at the later video on memory and RAM. So let's talk a bit about what you're going to do then to upgrade the CPU. So if you're upgrading your CPU, the first thing you'll need to do is remove the cooler, the CPU cooler that will be on top of the CPU. So you need to just undo the screws that are retaining the cooler and take it off the motherboard. And usually it will have some sort of paste or something on top of the old CPU and on the cooler. And you can see here, you just need to get a cloth and wipe that off. There is some stuff called gunk or a particular cleaner that you can get, a citrus base that will cut through that more effectively, but a clean cloth will do the job. Put it to one side, and then you can take the old CPU out by simply lifting the clip and lifting the CPU out of the socket that I've just described. And if you're replacing it with a CPU with the same socket type, then refitting is the reverse of removal. So you simply you need to look for pin 1. It will have a gold arrow on the side, and usually a gold arrow on the motherboard, or pin 1. So line up the arrow on the corner of the CPU with the arrow on the motherboard, or pin 1. It'll also have sockets at the side, so don't force it in. If it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit, and you can end up bending the pins and ruin the CPU. That's probably the most important thing to watch out for as you fit the CPU. Drop it into the slot, just make sure it fits nicely, and then you can actually clip it back in using the retaining clip. If you are simply replacing the CPU, then you'll already have the retaining parts of the cooler on the motherboard. So again, refitting is reverse of removal. So you will need to have some thermal paste. You see the thermal paste here, it's just to enable the cooler to draw the heat away from the CPU. And there are a lot of methods that are recommended for this, but I think the easiest one is you just need to carefully put a blob of paste in the middle of the CPU about the size of a pea. Just don't overdo it. If you overdo it, you can gunk up the whole motherboard. Just put about the size of a small pea, a blob in the middle of the motherboard. Then you can just fit the cooler back on top, and then screw it back down with whatever fixings are in place. And the only thing you need to remember on putting the cooler back on, I think it's quite useful to tighten up the opposite screws. So first do the two top and bottom alternate corners, and then tighten up the other two opposite screws, just so you keep the cooler balanced across the CPU. Don't tighten it too tightly. Tighten it down hand tight. You don't need to crank it down. In most cases, it won't go any further than the screws allow. So once it's screwed on, it's screwed on. If you're bringing in a new motherboard, or you're bringing in a completely new CPU, or you're swapping from an Intel to an AMD in particular, then you'll need to look what sort of cooler is capable of fitting the CPU. A lot of CPUs will come with their own cooler, but what they call an aftermarket cooler, the bigger ones, and you can see the one here, will enable you to keep the CPU cooler, and it'll run better and faster, particularly if later you want to overclock it. So it's slightly more complicated if you're swapping out the motherboard and fitting a whole new cooler, and I can't really cover that in this video, but again, it's relatively straightforward. Most coolers will have a back plate, a plate that goes underneath the motherboard that you fit first, a plate that it needs to screw onto. You just need to follow the instructions that come with the cooler. That will provide the bases of the connection once you fit it above the central processor unit. And really, once you fitted that back plate, you're back to where you are with replacing the CPU. Just simply putting the CPU in, closing the bracket, small pea size blob of the thermal paste, put the cooler on top, and then, as I say, alternate screws fix it down. In most cases, as you start the computer, it will automatically go into the BIOS. It'll notice that you've got a new CPU installed, and it will simply offer you, I think, the option to accept the defaults, and then it should, fingers crossed, start. So that is replacing the central processor unit. I think I say that's a relatively straightforward upgrade if you've already got the right socket. You just need to follow the instructions, particularly for the cooler. Make sure you line up the pins in the right socket, and don't force it. If it doesn't fit, it doesn't fit. You need to go back and think again whether you've got it the right way around. And that's about it for upgrading the CPU. And if that's all you're doing, good luck. That's all I've got for you in this video, and I'll catch you next time. Need to go back. Let's go back.